of CO2. Transport of gases in blood, that is transport of oxygen, we have already studied. Now we'll begin with the transport of CO2 in the blood. Now about O2 I have already discussed with you how much O2 is transported and in what conditions it is transported. Now about the CO2, around about 4 ml of CO2 is transported by every 100 ml of blood, and CO2 is transported in 3 forms in our blood. So I am repeating, about 4 ml of CO2 is transported by every 100 ml of blood, and it is transported in 3 forms. The first is in the dissolved form in plasma, that is about 5 to 7%, and as bicarbonates about 70%, and as carbaminohemoglobin about 23%. Now what happens in the plasma? In the plasma, CO2 is transported in the dissolved form around about 5 to 7%, and the remaining CO2 it enters into the erythrocyte. So I am repeating, about 5 to 7% of CO2 is transported in dissolved form in the plasma, and remaining CO2 enters the erythrocytes. Now what happens in the erythrocytes? Round about 70% is transported as bicarbonates. Now the erythrocytes have high concentration of enzyme called as carbonic anhydrase, which catalyze the following reactions, which I'll show you here on the screen. You can easily see the chemical reaction of CO2 binding with H2O in the presence of an enzyme carbonic anhydrase and forming bicarbonates, and then it again in the presence of an enzyme it will form the sodium bicarbonate and H ions. Now again you can see that the CO2 combining with the water forms H2CO3, and H2CO3 later on gives rise to HCO3 plus H ions. Therefore we can say some of the bicarbonates ion diffuse into the cytoplasm in exchange of Cl ions and are carried in the form of sodium bicarbonate, as I told you just, and the remaining bicarbonate ions in erythrocytes are carried as potassium bicarbonate. So this way the CO2 is transported as carbaminohemoglobin also, that is round about 23% to 25%. So about 20 to 25% of CO2 combines with amine radical of the globin part of hemoglobin and forms carbaminohemoglobin. So this way it is transported in 3 forms. First I told you in the form, it is in the dissolved form in plasma around about 5 to 7%, and as bicarbonates in the erythrocytes and as carbaminohemoglobin. This way you can easily understand that the carbon dioxide which is transported as carbamino, actually about 20 to 25% of CO2 is carried by hemoglobin, that is in the form of carbaminohemoglobin, and this process is actually, it occurs on the binding. So this binding occurs when O2 is low and PCO2 is higher in the tissues. Remember, in the tissues, whereas PCO2 is low and PO2 is higher in the alveoli. I am repeating, when does the CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin? various factors like they were required during the transportation of oxygen. Now here the binding occurs when PO2 is low and PCO2 is higher in the tissues, whereas PCO2 is low and PO2 is higher in the alveoli. Thus, the dissociation of CO2 from carbaminohemoglobin takes place. That means the CO2 get dissociated from carbaminohemoglobin. And about 70% of CO2 is carried as bicarbonates, which I told you just now. And erythrocytes, I told you they have high concentration of this enzyme, which is shown on the screen, that is carbonic anhydrase, which catalyzes the following reaction in both the direction. That means it is a reversible reaction. Some of the bicarbonate ions, that means HCO3, diffuse into the cytoplasm in the exchange of the Cl ions, and they are carried in the form of sodium bicarbonate, and the remaining bicarbonate ions in the erythrocytes are carried as potassium bicarbonate. At the alveolar site where PCO2 is low, the reaction proceeds to the opposite direction. I am repeating, at the alveolar site where the CO2 is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of CO2 and H2O. Thus, CO2 is trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to alveoli and released out as CO2. And I have already told you that around about 7% of CO2 is carried through plasma in a dissolved state, and in the beginning only I have mentioned you about 4 ml of CO2 is transported by every 100 ml of blood. That means every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers about 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli. Remember, here the blood is deoxygenated. That is, I am repeating, every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli. Now we will switch on to the regulation of respiration. Now, how is the process of respiration regulated? Actually, humans have the ability to maintain the moderate respiratory rhythm as per requirement of the body tissue, and the respiratory rhythm is thus under control of the nervous system and also receptors in the aortic arch and carotid artery. Okay, and thus the oxygen plays a insignificant role in regulation of the respiratory rhythm. And the respiratory rhythm center present in the medulla region of the brain is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center is pneumotaxic center present in the pons region of the brain, and it can moderate the functions of respiratory rhythm center by sending signals through the neural parts, and it can reduce the duration of inspiration, and thereby it will alter the respiratory rate. And a chemosensitive area is also situated adjacent to the rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ions. An increase in these substances can activate chemosensitive center, which can signal the rhythm center to make necessary adjustment in the respiratory process to eliminate these substances. And some respiratory associated receptors associated with aortic arch and carotid artery also recognize the changes in CO2 and H ion concentration and send necessary signals to the rhythm center for remedial actions. Thus, the role of oxygen is in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. Now we move on to the disorders of respiratory system. Here you can see on the screen the disorders of the respiratory system. First is asthma. It is caused due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. It is characterized by the spasm of the smooth muscles of the walls of bronchi and bronchioles. There is difficulty in breathing, causing whistling sound during breathing. Thus, it is helping it is not allowing the proper breathing, and therefore there is production of a whizzing sound. Another disease is emphysema. It is a chronic disorder in which alveolar walls are damaged, and due to the damage of alveolar wall, the respiratory surfaces are reduced, and therefore there is no proper binding of the oxygen, and therefore it is not helping in the proper breathing. Cigarette smoking is the major cause of this disorder. Another is the occupational respiratory disorder. In these diseases occur in those persons who work in certain industries like grinding or breaking of stones, cement factories. There is so much dust produced due to which the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope up with the situation, and long exposure to these can lead to fibrosis, and the lungs can also get damaged. So under long exposure, the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope up with this situation, and leading to the fibrosis, that is proliferation of the fibrous tissues, and therefore the lungs get damaged. Wearing protective masks can protect such disorders. Thank you.